A black swan event is an idea developed by Nassim Nicholas Taleb to describe an incredibly low probability occurrence. Humans are notoriously bad at trying to predict the future, in no small part because we have a bias toward predicting what seems most likely to happen. The truth is that history is full of insane bumps, turns, and crazy alleyways. In this video, I want to first look at two black swan events, talk about why the probability of their occurring was so insanely low, and discuss some ways that the world was totally changed because of them. I'll also try to point out the reasons that maybe they weren't so unlikely after all. Once I've gone over the two historical black swan examples, I'll give a breakdown of two theoretical black swans that I believe were pretty close to actually happening, approximately the same likelihood as the two examples I gave, as well as a breakdown of what I expect the outcomes to have been. The first of these black swan events is the Russian Revolution, specifically the 1917 October Revolution, or the coup by the Bolsheviks against the provisional government. In order to explain this one, I have to give a quick recap of Russian and European history leading up to the revolution. In the approximately 100 years between the Congress of Vienna and the outbreak of World War I, Europe had transformed itself from a society that would have seemed familiar to a peasant in the 13th century into one that a modern human would be largely able to navigate. The concepts of political parties, mass movements, factory work schedules, mass urban life, consumerism, and more all emerged as byproducts of the Second Industrial Revolution and its side effects. In order for a country not to be colonized, they needed to carefully balance a set of institutions and tools. First, access to raw resources, especially oil, both petroleum and otherwise, rubber and cotton, all of which were essential to the emerging industrial societies, but were not readily available in Western Europe. Second, a large and geographically secure heavy industry manufacturing base. This also required access to raw goods such as coal and steel, but those were more readily available in Western Europe. This manufacturing base was required to produce the endless stream of rations and weapons needed to mobilize and keep millions of men in the fields for years at a time. The 19th century empire was, at its core, forged in the blast furnace. Finally, a state of mass culture. Industrial proletariat life is alienating. Additionally, many of the old cultural foundations had been eaten away by the scientific method and rationalism. In order to convince millions to sacrifice their livelihoods, states needed to develop mass media, politics, and institutions, and none of them had the luxury of Great Britain to develop them gradually over the course of centuries. If even a single one of these pieces was missing, a state was at risk of being devoured, an experience that not even all of the European Christian states were able to avoid. In fact, the German plan, both in the imperial and Nazi empires for Russia, was to reduce it to an agricultural and raw resource colony. Russia in 1914 naturally had one of these three things. Spread across its vast empire were more than enough expendable labor and raw resources. Russian wheat fields in Ukraine fed Germany, and the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railroad in 1904 had opened up Siberia for exploitation. The problem was that because of Tsar Nicholas II's paranoia, he banned all political parties, suppressed the media, and actively avoided the creation of even a friendly mass political order that wasn't solely focused around him. Additionally, in part because of Russia's paranoia, but in larger part because of its geographical location, further away from the origin of the Industrial Revolution in northeastern England than other major European powers, a problem it could have overcome, as Japan did, but their leadership was too incompetent to solve. They blundered into World War I without an industrial base or proletariat class. In 1914, suddenly a government that had shown itself to be about as nimble as an obese elephant is forced to invent a mass culture and heavy industry out of thin air. Needless to say, they failed. Because of this, a revolution in Russia in 1917 is almost inevitable. The liberal bourgeois revolution that was the February Revolution under Kerensky is a possibility, as well as a more right-wing authoritarian one such as Ludendorff implemented in Germany during World War I. Even a possible replacement of Tsar Nicholas II with his cousin or younger brother taking the throne seems like a distinct possibility. What seems even more likely, though, is still a socialist revolution, since socialism was incredibly popular. The Constitutional Assembly in 1917, which was honestly a pretty fair election all things considered, returned a share greater than 70% for the socialist parties of some stripe, with only about 24% of that coming from the Bolsheviks. What is shocking is the fact that Lenin and what became Marxism-Leninism won out. All that it would have taken was a couple of people with spines, and Lenin would have been a very bald corpse. Even as late as July 1918, when the Left SR, or Socialist Revolutionary Party, revolted and seized control of the Cheka, or the secret police, the only thing that saved the life of Lenin and his revolution were their indecision in a moment of crisis. History has been totally changed by the victory of Lenin in the Russian Revolution, in much the same way that many liberal revolutions and movements in the 18th and 19th centuries modelled themselves off the American War for Independence and the British parliamentary system. Every 20th century Marxist was fueled by both the aspiration, that is, the total insanity of the odds that Lenin overcame, resources directly of Soviet Union. It's possible, although in my opinion unlikely, that communism might not have even turned into the repressive hell ideology that it is in so many ways today if, instead, say, Julius Martov, the leader of the Mensheviks, had won. It's very possible that Russia would have maintained its status as a bourgeois democracy. This is actually orthodox Marxism, and Lenin was, in so many ways, the heretic for believing that he could bypass the capitalist stage in economic development. Second, the Soviet Union's strategy to fight the Germans was literally best summarized by Trotsky himself as no war, no peace, or essentially just bury your head in the sand and hope the Germans go away. The Russian revolutionaries were so confident that the capitalist societies were about to collapse, they refused to fight the Germans or sign the initially much more lenient peace terms, leading to a total collapse in the front, and Germany getting what amounted to an unconditional surrender. Until the end of the war, the Soviets functioned as little more than a German puppet. The exact consequences of this is unclear, but one possible side effect is that this may have convinced the Entente that a separate peace with Germany was impossible, and only their total military defeat would end the war on acceptable terms, dragging it out for longer. Of course, in reality, Lenin did win, and I think this was basically driven by two facts. First is the overwhelming popularity of socialism as an ideology in Russia, both among the industrial workers and the rural farmers. The exact reasons for this are debated, but Lenin was about as fanatical as you could get and still be bound by some rules of reality, and so he was always going to have some type of audience. This, along with what the Bolsheviks' focus was, i.e. a professional revolutionary class, meant that they were able to consistently punch above their weight. Second, Lenin just kind of seemed like someone who had the ability to cheat the universe. There are some people who I think have the ability to open console commands, and Lenin just seemed like one of those people. His contemporaries all are in agreement that he was a force of nature, and this cannot be discounted. The second Black Swan event, to me, has to be the Spanish conquest of Latin America in the 15th and 16th centuries. This is an interesting one because on one hand, it's not totally unpredictable. The discovery of the Americas by European explorers and their eventual conquest, based on my reading of history, is essentially inevitable, both technologically and demographically, by the end of the Black Death in the 14th century. In North America, and the southern cone of South America especially, the climate is similar enough to Europe that the explosion of settler-style colonies in these areas feels almost inevitable. What's interesting, though, is Spain's ability to conquer an area of almost unimaginable size with hilariously small forces. In the case of the conquest of Peru by Pizarro, 168 men were able to topple an empire of millions. What is even more insane is that not only did Spain manage to conquer these areas, but they also managed to hold them at close to zero cost. Contrast this with the Mongols, whose empire fell apart incredibly quickly. In fact, the Spanish colonies in the Americas were so profitable that the government was able to get rid of their parliament, because dealing with the bourgeoisie and raising taxes was more difficult than just robbing the indigenous or mining gold. The best argument for the pure impossibility of this is to imagine that for a second you're playing a strategy game. You look away for a couple of years, and when you look back, a country that had previously been considered at best middle tier suddenly owned 10% of the surface area of the Earth. If you're playing regular speed in Civ, we're talking 1 or 2 turns. Spain was able to use their Scrooge McDuck vault of gold to fund an infinite religious war in Europe. It's possible that without Charles V as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the Protestant Reformation just wouldn't have even happened. Instead, the Catholic Church would have been forced to reform. The Habsburgs were able to stave this off and fight a non-stop state of war with pretty much every other country in Europe, in large part to preserve a decaying social order. The second side effect of this is the total lack of an independent indigenous identity in the Americas. In North America, the population of indigenous people was too small and the birth rate of English settlers high enough that they were on some level doomed from the start. The same thing cannot be said for societies like the Aztecs, who had large cities and complicated social structures. Even if the Spanish conquest still happened, but instead went about in a more piecemeal manner, taking, say, about 100 years longer instead of in some cases months, there's a good chance that Mexico would be as different from Europe as the Congo or Japan. Huge amounts of indigenous art, music, and literature were permanently destroyed by what amounted to a couple of lucky fanatical thugs. If their conquest had been slower, even if much had still been lost, far more would have remained. Additionally, without Spain earning such large profits from their colonies, there's a good chance the African slave trade just wouldn't have happened, or at least not to the level that it did in our timeline. A large part of the reason that millions of black slaves were brought to the plantations was an effort by European colonial governments to mimic the insane balance of power-altering profits that Spain was able to extract from their colonies. European adventurers looking for a quick buck and failing to find it in northeastern Brazil, the Caribbean, and the lowland South, instead turned to importing enslaved laborers so they could make money in their sleep. Additionally, the Spanish treatment of the indigenous people was so brutal in the early years that humanitarians called for an end to their enslavement and the replacement of them with black slaves from Africa, most notably Bartolomé de las Casas, although later he retracted his endorsement of African slave labour. Getting rid of the Atlantic slave trade is just so enormous, I'm going to stop here. The main argument for this actually not being a black swan was that both Spain and Portugal showed themselves to be ferocious and tenacious warriors and conquerors during this period of time. Iberian soldiers and sailors fought and won battles against almost every country in the world over and over again, often thousands of miles away from home, and were able to form coalitions with indigenous people, often to their own advantage. Additionally, the guns, germs, and steel argument of natural and geographical endowment makes European victory close to inevitable in the long run. There have been other periods of time, such as the scramble for Africa and the partition of Poland, where borders have changed, and large areas of land that in normal circumstances would have taken decades to checkerboard suddenly shift with little evidence of any real resistance. For the second part of the video, I'm going to be going over events that I think could have happened. First, Japan industrialized in Manchuria in the early 1930s. Southern Manchuria is ideal for an industrial revolution. Between it and Korea, Japan had at their disposal 55 million people, 15 million in Korea and 40 million in Manchuria. To give this number some context, in 1940, Germany's population was about 80 million. In addition to a large population, Manchuria is blessed with significant deposits of coal and iron ore, as well as fertile farmland. Japan could have pursued a policy of forced heavy industry in a similar manner to the Soviets under Stalin in the 1920s. If the Japanese had made 3 changes to their policies in the 20th century, this industrialization could have been accomplished relatively easily, with the minor detail of the death of millions. The first of these changes would have been the setting up of a proper puppet state earlier than they did in our timeline. In real life, the Japanese didn't formally exercise real day-to-day control in Manchuria until 1931, giving the window of time they had to industrialize the region before World War II at only 8 years. If instead, after the creation of the Kwantung Army in 1906, Japan had, say in 1920, set up a friendly puppet, they would have had a much longer window of time to implement their policies. 19 years of industrialization is worth a lot more than it would seem. For example, $1 compounded at 10% annually for 8 years is only $2.14. Over 19 years, though, this number goes up to $6.12, or almost 3 times as much. An additional benefit of the extra time is to allow the Japanese government to suppress and crush opposition to their rule. In real life, the short window of Japanese governance meant that they were limited in how much they could break, since they didn't have time to put it together again into something that would approach a real government. The second policy change would have been a shift in priority in the inter-service rivalry away from the Navy and into the Army. In real life, after being defeated by Soviet armor in a couple of clashes along the Manchurian border, the Japanese decided to focus on a southern route of expansion that took them into direct contact with America and the other European allies. The insane thing is that any Japanese military expert could have seen that they lacked the heavy industry to defeat Soviet armor, but somehow thought they could beat America, the UK, Netherlands, and France combined, along with their colonies such as Australia. If instead of focusing on expanding their navy and antagonizing the US and the UK, Japan instead used these resources to develop a strong armored military, they could probably have crushed the Chinese and made some serious progress against the Soviets. The final reform the Japanese needed to implement was the creation of a large proletariat class through forced urbanization. If Japan had used a price scissor similar to the one the Soviets used, where you purposely deflate agricultural prices relative to the cost of industrial goods in order to extract hard currency by exporting agricultural goods and forcing people into the cities, there's a good chance they could have achieved a similar level of industrial growth to the Soviet Union in the 1920s, albeit at a similarly heavy cost in terms of human life. Stalin was correct in some ways that if, in the 1920s, the Soviets hadn't crippled their entire economy in an effort to develop heavy industry, they probably would have lost to the Germans. The truth is that by World War II, armor was just king. As shown again and again and again, the ability of armor to outmaneuver and destroy infantry formations just cannot be ignored. If the Soviets couldn't have gone toe-to-toe with the Ruhr in terms of steel and bullet casings, Eastern Europe would not have been a fun place to have spent the 1940s. To reiterate, Japan wouldn't go to war with the Allies. Instead, Germany and Japan would double-team the Soviets. If they win is honestly still up in the air. The USSR has shown themselves to be shockingly resilient to situations that have crushed almost any other country. Additionally, I feel like America probably still would have gotten involved if for no other reason than just to keep China open. The second theoretical black swan event that I'm going to be looking at today is no World War I, World War II. And instead, these resources are spent on trying to keep the colonies. In our timeline, in 1914, Europe blew up their entire social, physical, and political capital, and then proceeded to do it again within the next generation. The impact of this was, for what might be the only time in history, an empire and culture of conquerors who had pillaged the world for centuries just gave up and went home. In our modern world, we think of the decolonization of Asia and Africa as almost inevitable, but I seriously think there was a chance that the decolonization process would have been much more bloody and protracted, and might even have never have happened at all. This is still a black swan in my book, because Europe managing to maintain the balance of power that had been set up after the defeat of Napoleon for another 40 years until nationalist movements began to spring up across their colonies would have required a couple of Bismarck-level politicians. The hilarious thing, though, is that these people already existed. They just devoted themselves to destroying European power, either intentionally, as in the case of Lenin, or unintentionally, as in the case of Hitler. If the leadership class in England had been slightly less paranoid about German naval construction, if the Germans had been more lucid about the actual weakness of Russian industrialization, if once a war had actually broken out, the powers had been able to walk themselves back, as they had from so many other catastrophes, European social order would have maintained itself for longer. The main side effect of this would have been an additional 40 years of colonial investment, creating a globalized industrial proletariat like we already have today much sooner. This would have resulted in stronger nationalist and mass political movements across Africa and South Asia, as these societies would have been forced to develop industrial institutions. The tragedy of this high level of economic development is that large parts of the world would be like apartheid South Africa, i.e., a large slave caste of workers supporting a small white minority who holds all the political power. Additionally, European powers would have been much more reliant on their colonies than they were in our timeline. The British colonial project was actually so expensive that their population just took the money that they previously spent on that and created a nanny state for themselves instead. This wouldn't be true in this timeline. European corporations and consumerism would have been reliant on the continued existence of this colonial dynamic they had created. Holding on to the colonies wouldn't just be a point of pride to Europeans. It would be a matter of economics, and historically, when the coin and the heart battle, the coin always wins. This timeline would devolve into a global bush war. Militarily, European colonial armies would have been able to trounce local African and Asian rebels. The fact that the Portuguese were able to defeat African independence movements in their colonies, even while surrounded by hostile nationalist black regimes in Africa until the 1970s, and they only lost because of the collapse of their fascist regime, leads me to believe that militarily, if Europe had wanted to, they didn't have to leave. Even in Algeria and Malaysia, the Europeans showed themselves capable of dealing militarily with insurgents, and it was only because of pressure at home that they were forced to withdraw. You have to remember that in this timeline, there's no discrediting of racism or nationalism, and the young men who died in Stalingrad or Dunkirk could have spilled their blood in the snows of the Serengeti instead. Honestly, I think that these independence movements would have eventually won. The fact of the matter is that the demographic disadvantage that Europe would have by the time the 21st century rolled around meant that I think England trying to maintain control of Nigeria, as well as Kenya and Egypt and large parts of the Middle East, let alone the billion-plus people who live in India, would have been pretty much impossible. Even if these independence movements eventually succeeded, this world would be a much darker place. That is all for today. Please like, subscribe, and comment. It is the only way the YouTube algorithm really notices me. Let me know what parts you agreed with and where you disagree. I'll see you all next time.